Does worker pay track with worker productivity? Do bureaucrats represent the American people? What does smuggling alcohol have to do with supporting tariffs? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look through those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and the broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from the R-squared value for the regression between pay and productivity, and we're just about at 1. The relationship between pay and productivity is an interesting question to look at in the economy because you want pay to track with productivity. You want people to get paid more when they're more productive. That's a good thing. And one of the questions that researchers have looked at recently is how well does pay track productivity in the United States? And one such researcher is Scott Winship. He is the director of the Center for Social Mobility and Opportunity at the American Enterprise Institute. He's also a senior fellow there. And he has a new paper out recently about this very question. And so we wanted to talk to him about what the data actually show. But first, before we talk about what the data actually show, well, why is it, Scott, that you wrote this paper? What is the claim that you are seeking to respond to that has been popularized in a lot of the media and around Washington, D.C.?
Well, thanks for the question, Dominic, and great to be on your show. Yeah, so there's a popular chart that probably most people have come across at one time or another, which shows two lines, basically. One of them is productivity, and one of them is some measure of worker pay. And these lines kind of moved together for a number of years in the mid-20th century, and then in 1973, they suddenly diverge. I think there's a whole website that's called WTF in 1973 or something like that. So, there's big divergence that happened. And so it's often claimed, that this was the point at which income inequality, neoliberalism, whatever your favorite boogeyman is, started to have this impact that destroyed the relationship between worker pay and the value that they provide to their employers. And it's a compelling chart. Gets often, becomes viral, but it is wrong in a number of ways that are pretty technical. And if you're not a nerd, it's sort of hard to understand that. And so I wanted to put out a paper that took as a starting point, what's happened to wages, and that used these charts to sort of begin with, and to show that actually when you do the correct measurement, that pay and productivity track pretty well, extremely well, actually, going back almost 100 years. And then to move from there to kind of a more complicated set of questions about, well, what's happened to the typical worker? And I think I sort of tripped into a pretty interesting set of stories about what's happened over the last 50 years or so.
Yeah, so this popularized notion is that there was this divergence sometime in the 70s where pay either flattened out or grew very slowly, and productivity kept growing at the rate it was growing at, and kept going. And so the sort of takeaway that we're supposed to have from a chart like that is that somebody else is taking the money that should belong to workers because they're not actually being paid for their productivity. Can we talk first again about what it is in economic theory, aside from the data, but what it is in economic theory that says that pay and productivity actually should track each other? They're supposed to track each other. Why is that the case on a theoretical basis?
Yeah, so the idea is that ultimately workers are paid as much as the additional value that they provide to their employer. So an employer, has a decision at any point to hire, one additional worker. They, in theory, will hire that worker if they can pay them the amount that will equal the additional value that worker brings to the firm, the marginal value. And so, in theory, the marginal workers' productivity should equal the marginal workers' pay. Under a few simplifying assumptions, it also means that the average workers' productivity should equal the average workers' pay. And so in theory, pay and productivity should follow the same trend over time. There are some other, you can find ways to complicate that basic intuition. There are some sectors of the economy like manufacturing that are higher productivity and higher productivity growth. And so if it was the case that everybody got pulled into manufacturing jobs, none of us would be able to get a haircut because there wouldn't be hairstylists to provide the services. And so, what ends up happening is that the price of haircuts goes up and barbers and hairstylists get paid more. So they're actually getting paid, maybe the increase in their pay is maybe higher than the increase in their productivity. But, I think as a starting point, believing that if productivity doubles, pay should also double is a pretty safe place to start.
Yeah, and then obviously in the real world, it doesn't work out exactly that way because the real world is not an economics textbook, and there's all these kinds of frictions that we have in labor markets that might mess it up a little bit. But what you find in the paper is that actually it's pretty darn good. It's pretty close to what theory says it should be. And you start by critiquing the methodology of the claims to the contrary. So you look at the claims that are made by these various studies that have tried to say that there's a huge divergence between pay and productivity, and you walk through ways that they are comparing apples and oranges, basically. So can you explain a little bit more about why they did not look at the data in a theoretically sound way?
Yep, absolutely. And it's interesting. This is, kind of a set of mistakes that get made by analysts that are associated with the left, analysts associated with the right, kind of more centrist analysts. So I show kind of three examples of these these scary but incorrect charts. And, the mistakes that are made are pretty typical from one to another. It's a matter of comparing different sectors of the economy, for instance. So maybe the productivity line reflects the entire economy, but the pay line only reflects production and non-supervisory workers. Or it's the non-farm business sector, for instance, which excludes government and farms, among other parts of the economy. You really want to make sure that you're using the same sector for both your productivity line and for your pay line. Another big mistake is that they adjust for inflation in incompatible ways. So, you adjust productivity for inflation using one price index, and you adjust pay for inflation using a completely different one. Those should really be the same. If you're going to adjust for inflation, it's not actually necessary to do that. But if you do adjust for inflation, you've got to do it consistently. There are all kinds of technical issues around what to do with depreciation. So part of the economy's output is sort of immediately plowed back into firms to replace equipment and capital that has become out of date or worn down. That is output that can't really be shared with workers. It also doesn't go to to the owners of firms either. It's purely just to keep production operating at the same level that it is. And so you've got to exclude depreciation from your analyses. There are questions about including the self-employed that get very complicated. If you're, a sole proprietor, how much of your income, reflects your labor versus the capital? It's often pretty hard to divide those from each other. There are issues with incorporating the housing sector, where there's another stream of income that isn't really about what's going to workers and what's going to owners. It's really just a flow of benefits that people get from owning their home in lieu of having to pay rent to somebody. But if you include that in your analyses as if it were going to owners, then that screws up the analyses as well. And then finally, you occasionally see something really egregious, which is that instead of looking at worker compensation, you look at hourly wages. So you completely ignore non-wage compensation, such as healthcare benefits, retirement contributions by employers. That's a pretty egregious one that my friends at American Compass make, for instance, in the chart that I show.
So you look at the data as well. All of these data sets are all publicly available. All of this is, from government statistics that they put out that are available to every researcher to look at. And so it's really just a choice of how you want to present the data. And so you go through and seek to rectify these errors that you mentioned and try to get real apples to apples comparisons with the same sectors of the economy, with the same adjustments for inflation, all of that kind of stuff. And you look at it in 6 different ways in the paper. What did you find in those 6 different examples?
Yeah, I was sort of surprised that you could show this relationship, that actually, there is a very strong relationship between pay and productivity in 6 different ways. I've sort of made versions of these charts before, just as kind of one-off. Here's a chart for the non-farm business sector, for instance. But it turns out, you can look at the non-financial corporate sector, you can look at the corporate sector, you can look at hourly pay versus hourly productivity, or you can look at aggregate compensation versus aggregate output of the economy. And you can start at different points in time. You can sort of look at trends from 1973 forward, or you can look at trends from 1948 forward. And I found that even if you go back to 1929, is the furthest back I try to go. So over 95 years, pay is exactly where the productivity increase would predict by those numbers. So it's really just a matter of knowing what data is out there. These, as you said, these are all publicly available series, but if you don't know where to find them, it's actually really difficult to track this stuff down. In a couple of cases, you have to go to some older books that were published in the mid 20th century to extend some of the series back. So I'd just been working on this for a number of years off and on, and had developed a data set that had everything that I needed. And I was really surprised that you could show this 6 different ways. This is not like a question. I think a few people on Twitter were sort of saying, "Oh, this is just a straw man." Nobody believes that anything other than that pay should track productivity, and that's just not true at all. I would say even in academia, among academic economists, which I should be clear, my training isn't in economics. You see papers that claim that pay and productivity haven't tracked each other, or that labor's share of income has declined. The idea being that income is essentially divided up between workers and owners, and the share going to workers has fallen over time. Well, if pay has tracked productivity over time, that also means that labor's share of income hasn't fallen. So, there are papers by very big name economists that are trying to explain, this decline that I find that didn't really happen if you measure everything the right way. So it's a point that is not a straw man at all, and that I think even a lot of people in academic economics are unaware of.
And so in the paper, you're saying that this narrative of complete doom and gloom is wrong, but you're not saying, on the contrary, that everything is fantastic and everything's amazing. You find what the real problem is what you call productivity inequality, which is sort of different than what we hear about usually. Usually we hear about income inequality, but you make a point about productivity inequality. So can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So I show in the paper, kind of after showing that aggregate pay and aggregate productivity have tracked each other really, really well, I kind of immediately want to then say, it is true that the median worker's pay has not kept up with aggregate productivity over time. And so some of these charts that you see that have this very striking divergence in 1973 are generally okay, but they're showing what the pay of the median worker, what that trend was over time, and they're comparing it to aggregate productivity. Now, the issue there is, the economic theory wouldn't necessarily predict that the median worker's pay, that's to say the worker whose pay is right in the middle, they're paid more than half the population and they're paid less than half the population. But nothing in theory says that worker's pay should track aggregate productivity. What the theory predicts is that person's pay should track the median worker's productivity. And so unfortunately, we don't have measures of individual workers' productivity for the most part. We don't have, great statistics nationally on what's happened to median productivity over time. So it's impossible to kind of show the right chart that would look at the same workers over time. And so I just sort of look to studies that have been done over the last 20 years, of which, there's a whole literature that's developed around productivity differences between industries, differences between firms within the same industry, and productivity differences within individual firms. And all of that research shows that inequality in productivity is increasing over time. It's increasing in the same way that pay inequality is increasing between industries, between firms, between workers. And so it really suggests that, again, pay is tracking productivity. It's just different workers have different productivity and therefore have had different trends in pay. So I think that's probably one of the two big explanations that I have for why the median workers' pay hasn't kept up.
And the other one you talk about in the paper is changes in gender roles and changes in social ideas of what work should be from the 1940s through about the 1960s, and then from the 1960s through to today. So what was the change in there, and how does that affect? I mean, I think most people know what the change is, which is that more women entered the formal workforce since the 1960s. And so how does that change this story? How does that relate directly to this story about median pay and productivity?
Yeah, so this part of the paper is probably a little bit more controversial. It's kind of where I unveil my dirty sociology background. I think a lot of people kind of have in their heads a story that is similar to what I'm arguing, but which is a little different. And the story that a lot of people talk about is that in the 1970s and 1980s, a lot more women joined the workforce. Competition for jobs increased quite a bit for men. Therefore, you increase the supply of labor and wages go down. Sort of the same argument that people make if they think that immigration has depressed wages in the United States. You increase the labor supply, the equilibrium wage will go down, and that's kind of what happened to guys over time. My argument is a little bit different. I don't discount that might have happened as well. It almost surely did. But I make a slightly different point, which is that men in the early to mid 20th century, a lot of men were actually paid more than their value to their employer. So we talked about what economic theory would predict. I think that there was this period where we thought a single husband should be able to raise a family on one income, that was just a norm that was incredibly widespread. It was one of the main things that the labor movement was trying to secure for its workers. It was enforced in a variety of ways that involved excluding women from certain occupations. As late as the 1940s, early 1950s, there were union contracts that said if a woman got married, that she had to quit, she had to leave, she had to be fired. And so it was just a completely different time, and that men essentially got a pay bump by virtue of being men in this period that we had much more traditional gender roles. So I've been sort of saying that off and on Twitter and elsewhere for 10 years or so. And in this paper, I finally kind of put up some evidence to show it. And the evidence that I compile, shows that if you go back to 1929, say, and you look at the trend in the median workers' pay, and you look at the trend in productivity, what you find is there was a period from the early 1930s until about 1960, where pay was first increasing faster than productivity and then remaining elevated. And then even in the 1960s, when the two started to converge again, it wasn't until the mid-1990s that pay and productivity end up at the same place that you would have guessed, if you were sitting in 1929. So when researchers start with 1948 or they start with 1973, they're starting from a point where a lot of workers are actually being paid more than what economic theory would predict. And so, what happened is that as more and more women entered the workforce, this norm about paying a man enough to raise a family on one income doesn't make any sense anymore. If somebody's wife is also working, you don't pay him more than what you were going to. And so gradually men's pay declines for a little bit, and then and otherwise just grows more slowly than productivity grows, until you get to a point where in the 1990s, again, pay is at a rational level. And then you see men's pay increasing with productivity again, just like it's doing for women's pay. So that's what I argue was the other big reason why median pay lagged productivity growth over time. It was kind of this great correction in moving from kind of one historical era to another historical era.
Yeah, you say it's a little bit like comparing, looking at housing prices and starting with a housing boom and then comparing that to, a more normal period and saying, oh, look, it went down, when really it didn't go down. It was actually normal and it was way higher to start with.
Yep.
And what's interesting, though, about both these stories, both the breadwinner story and the productivity inequality story, is that both of them are actually further confirmations that pay does track productivity, because you're saying in both cases that, in the one case, you're returning to what productivity suggests that pay should be. And in the other case, you're saying that these higher productivity industries are getting paid more, and therefore it's throwing off the median relative to the average. And so what do we take away from this, right? Because if it's not true that pay and productivity had this huge divergence, which I think you pretty clearly show is not true, then what are the actual problems that policymakers should be looking at? Because if they're not starting with the right diagnosis of the problem, then they're not going to get a solution that makes any sense.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I probably could have been a little bit clearer in the policy section. I mean, the first big point that I make is to really try to refute the idea that you hear a lot among populists, which is essentially, why should we pursue economic growth? Because it's only going to benefit folks at the very top. The economy is broken, such that increases in growth don't affect the person in the middle at all. And that's an argument about, looking at that pay versus productivity chart and the lines diverge, of saying like, hey, the two lines should have kept rising together and they didn't. Something's fundamentally broken. And so I argue absolutely not. Like if the argument is that pay should be tracking productivity over time, it looks like it's doing that as well as it ever did. It looks like it's been doing that for 95 years. Therefore, we ought to want to increase economic growth, and it will benefit middle income workers. Of course, the second point is that the median productivity probably hasn't grown as much as overall productivity, and so it is true that economic growth is not going to increase everybody's incomes equally. So, what do you do for the median worker? Well, there I think really it's sort of looking to tomorrow's workers, people who are kids today, young adults, making sure that they have skills that are going to maximize their productivity levels, so that they can benefit them as much from economic growth as they can. Which can be things as simple as folks who go to community college, even the range of certificates that you can get at a community college in terms of the payoff to you once you enter the labor market is extraordinarily wide. And so, encouraging people to enter into some programs, get some certificates rather than others, is a way of increasing their productivity and ensuring that their pay goes up. I think preparing kids in school better, and increasing the quality of education for a lot of kids. I think it goes as far back, I think, as early childhood, and making sure kids are ready to start school in kindergarten. You see these gigantic gaps in school readiness as early as age 3, 4, or 5. So trying to, for the most disadvantaged kids, trying to get them more school ready, provide kids with more opportunities to match their educational programs to their needs and what their parents are looking for. So that calls for more educational choice, charter schools, vouchers, things like that. So I think that's another big policy area is, what another way of putting it is just we want to expand upward mobility, and that requires policies that are looking at kids before they become workers. I think there are ways to increase productivity for the median worker once they are a worker, but that's a lot tougher than just making sure that tomorrow's workers are better prepared to get those jobs. And then I don't make a lot of it in the paper, but I think there's also room for a third set of policies, possibly more controversial, which would be around helping men who currently are not high skilled, who have lower productivity themselves and therefore can't command wages that are as high as we might like. Richard Reeves has a great book that folks are probably aware of called Of Boys and Men, where he talks about all the ways that boys have kind of fallen behind girls in school, in a lot of metrics in the labor market. there's something about the service sector economy that it seems like men have had a hard time adjusting to, whether it's not having, the right soft skills. Something about the service sector has helped women to do better than men. And so encouraging men to go into different fields that are expanding, I think, would be valuable. Increasing expectations on men, I think, would be pretty valuable. I have a small section of the paper where I argue that men's wages have gone down in part because, as marriage has declined, there's a much smaller role for men out there in the world. They're not breadwinners anymore for the most part. They don't have necessarily a ton of kids whose mouths they need to feed. If they're married, they have a working partner a lot of times. And so it's easier for them to sometimes have a spotty career, some of them dropping in and out of the labor force, some of them, just having the luxury of, not having to find the job that maximizes their pay or to take the first job that comes their way if they're unemployed. So male labor force dropout, I think, is a pretty big problem. But I don't think it's a problem about a lack of jobs in the workforce. I think it's much more a problem of lack of motivation, lack of roles, and the alternative options for support out there, which include things like disability benefits and some other safety net benefits. So there's a whole agenda around encouraging men to enter the workforce and supporting them more, trying to find new roles for them to replace the old kind of breadwinner manufacturing era roles.
One of the things that I always think is frustrating about these kinds of conversations is that if somebody goes out and makes a maximalist doom and gloom argument, and then someone like you comes along and says, no, actually, that's not quite right because you're looking at the data wrong, then you get accused of saying, oh, well, you're just ignoring all the real problems because you think everything is great. And I think this paper is a good example of how you can critique the maximalist doom and gloom case while also saying, look, there are real problems. We just need to figure out what the real problems are and then propose solutions that would actually help to solve those problems rather than inventing a problem and trying to solve that with policy that probably won't end up helping in the end. So thanks so much for walking us through that, Scott. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
In the United States, we have a democratic system of government. I mean that in the sense of democratic written with a lowercase d to mean that we have elections that confer legitimacy on the people that we elect to be our representatives and to make governing decisions on our behalf, according to a constitution and according to the laws that have already been passed. Outside of that system, though, operates the bureaucracy. In some senses, it's within democracy, right? Because everything that the bureaucracy has, they got because of some law that was passed by some Congress, and many of the people who run it are appointed by the president and can be removed by the president. But it's an interesting question. Do bureaucrats actually represent the American people? This question comes up because Jonathan Cantor, the Assistant Attorney General for the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, gave a speech in Washington, D.C. that he began by saying, "My name is Jonathan Cantor, and I represent the people of the United States of America." He went on to call himself the people's lawyer. And he said, people struggling to afford groceries, make rent, get meaningful employment, they all depend on antitrust enforcement to protect their interests. Now, in one sense, Cantor is the people's lawyer, simply because he's the one who argues the side of antitrust cases that's called the United States. A lot of these cases are some company versus the United States. And so he argues the side of the United States in the lawsuit. And so in some sense, I guess you could say he's the people's lawyer. But I don't remember ever voting for Jonathan Cantor. I don't remember voting for any of the assistant attorneys general, I should say. I don't remember voting for the attorney general either, for that matter. Now, Cantor is part of the Biden administration's efforts to rewrite antitrust law. They're not doing this because Congress passed a law to change antitrust law. They're doing this because the laws that Congress has passed end up giving the executive branch, through the Federal Trade Commission and the DOJ Antitrust Division, a lot of latitude to interpret the laws and decide how they'll be enforced. Since the 1980s, antitrust enforcement has followed what's called the Consumer Welfare Standard. This has been done by Democrats and Republicans, and it says that antitrust enforcement should be guided by whether a merger would result in higher prices or some other type of harm to consumers. Cantor, along with Lena Khan at the Federal Trade Commission under the Biden administration, want to change that to what's called a neo-Brandeisian approach. That approach to antitrust basically says that big companies are bad for their own sake and we should just oppose all mergers, or at least most mergers, to prevent higher market concentration. It's always funny when progressives seek to vilify populism, when at the same time making extremely populist arguments about economics. We see this in Cantor's speech. He's straightforwardly saying that he's fighting for the little guy. He's the people's lawyer. But again, the people didn't vote for him, and the people didn't decide who to sue. If you went out to most people in the United States and you said, and you gave them a list of possible antitrust cases and said, which ones of these do you think the government should pursue? Most of them would have no opinion at all because they have no idea. If to the extent they would have an opinion, it would probably be because of a few stray impressions they might have of a company. They might have had a bad experience that biases them against that company, and they'd say, sure, well, let's punish them. Or there might be companies that have been the subject of negative PR campaigns for many years, and they might say, well, I don't like that company because of what I've heard about it. But what they wouldn't be doing is any kind of economic analysis on whether a merger would be a good idea or not, or whether an antitrust case to break up an existing company would be a good idea or not. Pursuing antitrust for popular reasons shows why it's dangerous to have bureaucrats as representatives of the people. The representatives of the people in the United States government, helpfully, they're called representatives. They serve in the House. They're directly elected by the people. We have a Senate. Senators are directly elected by the voters in each state. And then we have the president, who's indirectly elected through the Electoral College. Those people are the representatives of the people. They have very specific jobs under the Constitution. That is not true of the Assistant Attorney General for the DOJ Antitrust Division. He exists to pursue the laws and actions that the people's representatives have decided. His job is to execute the law. It is not to make the law, and it is not to try to seek out what would be more representative of the people. When you give a bureaucrat power like that, it's going to get abused. Now, it's especially funny coming from Cantor because he was a corporate lawyer for many years, does very well for himself, by no means is some kind of downtrodden, poor individual. But it's not just him. There's this mindset is widespread in bureaucracy that it's the job of the bureaucracy to sort of clean up where the representative branches of government have left off or have been found lacking in some way. That's not their job. And when they try to do that job, they're probably going to abuse their power. It's probably going to harm consumers more than it'll help. Speaking of which, we see this dynamic at play in the conversation about trade. Who was one of the people that pursued protectionism during the Trump administration? One of the top proponents of that, aside from the president himself, was Robert Lighthizer. Robert Lighthizer was the U.S. trade representative for all 4 years of Donald Trump's first term. He wrote a book called No Trade is Free. It came out after he was done as trade representative, and Patrick Lynch wrote a review of it for American Institute for Economic Research, which also, of course, hosts Econception. Lynch's review says basically there's no reason to take this book too seriously as an economics book. It's really a political book. And when you look at the political economy of tariffs, rather than just the economics of tariffs, it provides a whole new way of seeing why they don't usually work out. What Lynch zeroes in on is two different things: public choice economics and the Baptists and bootleggers phenomenon. So public choice economics says that politicians are self-interested just like individuals are. There's no reason to assume that their self-interest goes away just because they're in government. As a result of that, politicians seek to do things to get reelected. And so that's why we see tariffs often talked about during campaigns, often targeted at industries in specific swing states. We've seen this with steel tariffs, which are especially impactful in Pennsylvania and Ohio. Pennsylvania is one of the most competitive swing states. Ohio used to be more competitive and is still relatively close. But Lynch talks about how tariffs can be pursued by politicians because their benefits are concentrated to those key industries that are usually politically targeted to help with elections, and the costs are spread out over the whole economy. So you have a steel company that's helped by a tariff, everyone else paying slightly higher prices for steel all across the economy. If you add it all up, it adds up to a big difference, but for each individual, it's probably only a couple dollars a year. And so if a politician can say, hey, I can take a couple dollars a year from these people and then channel it all to one politically beneficial industry, that's a good deal for a politician. But remember, there's lots of politicians in the United States. Eventually, if you keep following this logic, you end up taking a lot of money from a lot of people and then channeling it to specific politically connected industries. Not a great idea. Lynch goes on to talk about Baptists and bootleggers. This is what smuggling alcohol has to do with supporting tariffs. This concept came from the economist Bruce Yandel, who wrote about how during Prohibition, Baptists supported Prohibition because they were morally opposed to alcohol, and bootleggers also supported Prohibition because if alcohol was made legal, they wouldn't make any more money. You only need bootleggers when alcohol is illegal. So there was this weird effect where you had people making sincere moral arguments on the same side as criminals in supporting government policy. Yandel argues this happens all the time in politics because the expression politics makes strange bedfellows actually turns out to be true. Lynch makes the argument that Lighthizer is a perfect example of this. He actually does both. He makes the moral case for tariffs in his book, but he himself personally benefits because he worked most of his career when he wasn't in government as a lobbyist for the steel industry. He made lots of money doing that. Millions of dollars. He's a Washington, D.C. insider if there ever was such a thing. And so Lynch concludes, Bob Lighthizer wants you to join him in what he claims is a moral crusade to save a few American jobs. He fails to mention that ultimately we will all pay much higher costs to do this, and that he, his friends and former clients, and a very narrow sliver of the nation will benefit. That's the real story of how tariffs actually work in practice. They're not made by industry experts that are seeking to maximize economic growth. They're made by politicians and advisors to politicians who are trying to do the best thing for themselves politically, and that's almost never going to be what's best for the country economically. Now it's time for the paper of the episode, but before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know you enjoy the show and makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. I let Scott pick the paper of the episode from the Quarterly Journal of Economics, initially an NBER working paper from 2014. by Raj Chetty, Nathaniel Hendren, Patrick Klein, and Emmanuel Saez. Where is the land of opportunity? The geography of intergenerational mobility in the United States. Here's Scott to tell you about it.
So the paper I'd recommend is maybe one that maybe some of your listeners haven't come across. It was really the inaugural paper of Raj Chetty, who's a Harvard economist, and his team at what became Opportunity Insights, an organization that studies upward mobility and opportunity. Their very first paper that hit it big was called Where is the Land of Opportunity? I think it was published in 2014, if I'm getting that right. And, it's sort of the entry point to a couple dozen papers that his team has produced over the last 10 years. This first one was the one that introduced his mobility measure, which was unique in that it came from tax data that most people don't have access to. And, really the entire paper was kind of this big map that showed that some parts of the country have a lot more upward mobility for poor kids than other parts of the country. Living in Salt Lake City, Utah versus Atlanta, Georgia is kind of the difference between living in, a country like Denmark or a country like the United Kingdom in terms of mobility levels. And it just opens up a fascinating series of questions about what is it that Salt Lake City's doing that Atlanta isn't? Is it not really doing anything? It's just the kind of people that live in Salt Lake City are high upward mobility people, and vice versa. Just a incredibly well done paper that hopefully will lead you towards reading the subsequent papers that his team has done.
Where is the Land of Opportunity? The Geography of Intergenerational Mobility in the United States by Chetty, Hendren, Klein, and Saez. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated, and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.